Okay, Nadia, go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the participants from all over the world. Welcome to this webinar, From War to Practice. It's the 6th session that the Global Coalition on Deinstitutionalization is organizing. So I will start firstly with technical practicalities. Yeah, so we have Zoom interpretation. If you are using a laptop, you can see down on the screen, there is a button with the globe. And if you click on it, there is an interpretation. And then you can choose the language that you want. There is also American Sign Language to see the sign language interpreter. Thank you. For those who are following us on mobile phone, I want interpretation. When you see downstairs, there are 3 dots. When you click on that, you have language interpretation, and then you will see the option of the language. So also there you can click, for example, on your language or on sign language, American Sign Language, to see the interpreter. You can also click on the button Mute Original Audio so that you hear only the interpretation and the language that you want. But you need to save, you need to click on Done to save your changes. And then for those who need closed captioning, please click on the closed captioning button in the Zoom menu downstairs where you can see the captioning. And so you can increase the font size if you click on the subtitle settings. And so you can move slider to adjust the captioning size that fits you best. And so then also to view the captioning transcript completely, click on the show full transcription and you will have it just beside you. So thank you very much for this. So without further ado, so my name is Nadia Hadad. I'm one of the 2 co-chairs for the European Network on Independent Living. We will start now the 6th session, really focusing on the chapters from 1 to 3 of the guidelines of deinstitutionalization that the CRPD committee members submitted now 2 years ago. We will focus on the concept, the key concept, on the definitions and the value that needs to be really rightly and correctly interpreted and understood in the process of deinstitutionalization. So the agenda of today, we have different people with different perspectives from a little bit all over the world. So but before we start that, I will say I will give some accessibility tips also about, say, your name and your organization when you speak. Try to use plain language and no jargon, please. And also keep your microphone muted so there is no background noise. And also keep your points short and clear as much as you can. And also try to respect the timing, as well as for the speakers, as those who are asking questions later on during the question and answer section. And try just to be very clear. So without further ado, we are going to start now on a very important topic about what makes a good deinstitutionalization strategy really good. So applying the guidelines on deinstitutionalization during the state party review process is something very important. And we have an excellent speaker with us, nobody else than Miyeon Kim. She is a member of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disability from South Korea. So Kim, I give you the floor and happy to listen to your participation. Thank you.
You are muted, Miyeon. Oh,
yeah, yes. Yeah. Everybody, today I'm privileged to address a critical topic. What makes a good deinstitutionalization strategy? During the state party review process under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, We continually strive to promote independent living and inclusion in the community for persons with disabilities. As a member of the committee, I will look into the legal foundations, practical applications, and the pitfall to avoid in pursuing successful deinstitutionalization strategy today. Next slide. First, legal foundation and value of the guideline. The guideline on the institutionalization are built upon General Comment number 5, which addresses the right to live independently and be included in the community under Article 19 of the CRPD. These guidelines are more than recommendations. They serve as authoritative guidance on implementing the institutionalization processes. Also not legally binding, it provides an interpretative framework that supports CRPD implementation. The guideline explicitly frames institutionalization as a form of segregation and a violation of human rights, underscoring the need to replace it with community-based support. This expanded understanding is essential for states to make transformative, right-respecting changes. Next slide. Practical application. One of the most significant challenges for state parties is translating these guidelines into actionable policies. A comprehensive deinstitutionalization strategy should include specific timelines, measurable outcomes, and a detailed roadmap for closing institutions and developing alternative services in the community. This entails legislative reforms. Countries must dismantle laws that allow involuntary institutionalization or substitute decision-making based on disability. For example, repealing guardianship laws that strip persons with disabilities of their autonomy is fundamental. Budget allocation. Redirecting funds from institutional care to community-based services is crucial. Without sustained financial support, community alternatives will fail, facing persons with disabilities back into institutional settings. We need to robust investment in accessible housing, personal assistance services, and independent living support. Service development and training. States should focus on developing a wide range of community-based support options and train personnel in a right-based approach. The move toward independent living requires services tailored to the individual's needs, ensuring that each person can access support on their terms. Next slide, please. How the CRPD committee used the guideline in evaluating the institutionalization processes under the Article 19? During the State Party review process, the committee employed these guidelines as a benchmark for assessing a country's deinstitutionalization efforts. We especially look for clear and achievable timelines. Closing institutions without the concrete timeline often lead to delays. An effective deinstitutionalization strategy should have a realistic yet ambitious time frame with deadline for closing institutions and scaling up community services. Diversity and alternatives. It's essential that countries develop varied community-based living options. This can range from supported living arrangement to peer support networks. The key is to ensure that persons with disability can choose where and with whom they live, rather than being restricted to specific settings. Inclusion of persons with disabilities. The committee valued the direct involvement of persons with disabilities in these processes. Their insight and life experience are crucial in designing policies that genuinely addresses their needs. National organizations representing persons with disabilities should be involved from the planning to the implementing process. Next, common mistake in the institutionalization process and lessons learned. From our review, certain recurring mistakes emerge. These include inadequate community services. Some countries prematurely close institutions without ensuring adequate community services are in place. This often leads to re-institutionalization in other forms, such as group homes or halfway houses. These settings, while smaller, can still restrict autonomy and lack the personalized support necessary for true community inclusion. Tokenistic inclusion. Another pitfall is including persons with disability in name only, without giving them meaningful roles in decision-making. To avoid this, states must ensure that consultation with persons with disabilities organizations are not only formalized, but are valued as central to the deinstitutionalization process. Funding misallocation. Many state parties continue to allocate sustainable resources to renovate or expand the institutions rather than redirecting these funds to community-based services. This practice reinforces the institutional model and directs from genuine deinstitutionalization effort. Next slide. Additional elements of a successful deinstitutionalization strategy. A successful deinstitutionalization strategy involves more than merely closing institutions. It requires a societal shift toward inclusivity and accessibility in all aspects of life. Here are additional considerations. Awareness raising campaign needed. Community attitude toward persons with disabilities play a crucial role in the institutionalization's success. Public education campaigns can help dismantle stigma, making community more welcoming and supportive. And intersectional support system needed. The institutionalization strategy must also recognize the intersectional needs of persons with disabilities. For example, women and girls with disabilities often face heightened risk of gender-based violence. Inclusive deinstitutionalization strategy must account for these risks and provide tailored protection and support. Empowering persons with disability to exercise legal capacity is needed. Supporting persons with disabilities in exercising their legal capacity is fundamental to deinstitutionalization. States should replace substitute decision-making models with supported decision-making approach, empowering individuals to make their own choices. Next slide. Ian and I asked me during my speech to introduce a good example of South Korea. So I'm going to briefly tell you about it. The Korean government's deinstitution policy is still insufficient. For all people with disability who needed 24-hour assistance, 24 hours assisted is very weak. The Korean government is still reinvesting in repairing institutions for persons with disability instead of community-based services. The institution of accessibility in public housing and bus system for the person with disability in Korea are not perfect. However, the positive thing is that I think the Act on Personal Assistance for Persons with Disabilities and the Act on the Rights of Health for Persons with Disabilities exist in Korea. There is a very strong human rights movement for the deinstitutionalization. I think that best practice in Korea is a tireless human rights movement for the deinstitutionalization by human rights activists with disabilities and their communities. They have been engaged in long human rights struggle and also negotiation with local governments and administration tirelessly. I believe that society turns into a constant struggle for persons with disabilities. They are also imprisoned in prison during the process of the institutionalizations process. However, Korean society is hopeful. This is because there are these human rights activists with disabilities that continuously struggle for the institutionalization. Next slide, please. In closing, I would like to emphasize that a good deinstitutionalization strategy is not just about the values, but about transformations. It is about enabling persons with disability to live with dignity, autonomy, and equal access to the community. This required long-term commitment, dedicated resources, and a genius shift in societal attitudes. We, as advocates and experts, must hold state parties accountable to their obligation under the CLPD and push for a future where every person with disability can truly say they belong in their communities. Thank you so much. Actually, I prepared a frank question and answer. How many I have time now? Remind?
Yeah, still some 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Yes, I will choose the question. Would you go to the question number 2? What I received like this question. What is the biggest challenge in the process of deinstitutionalization? Answer is, one of the biggest challenges is ensuring adequate community-based services are available before closing institutions. Without the sufficient resource and support system, closing institutions prematurely may leave persons with disability without the necessary support, leading to instability or even reinstitutionalization. Therefore, a successful deinstitutionalization process relies on proper funding and the development of robust community support systems. And I'll go to the question 3. What are some common mistakes countries make during the deinstitutionalization process? Many countries mistakenly turn to the small-scale institutions, such as group home and halfway houses, as a replacement for larger institutions. While smaller, these settings can still limit the autonomy and do not always provide the personalized support necessary for true community inclusion. Real deinstitutionalization should prioritize community-based services that allow individuals to make their own choices about their lives rather than simply reshaping institutions. Now I'm finishing. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Miyeon, for highlighting again the important role that the CRPD committee does in reminding all member states about their obligation under the CRPD and under the general comments and under the DI guidelines to make really decentralization reality, and also to share with us good practice and also actions, concrete actions that they could apply that we will definitely can use as a civil society, as DPOs, when we are going to lobby with our government. So thank you very much. And as you said, one of those bad examples, that the misinterpretation of the governments Ali, will be highlighted in the next few minutes. We will have Sofie Fiddelaers with us, and she will testimony on how she avoided institutionalization by the way she is living now. She will come now, and Sofie, the floor is yours. Ga je gang maar.
Hallo iedereen, ik ben Sofie, ik ben 48 jaar. Mijn hele schoolcarrière heb ik in een buitengewoon onderwijs gedaan. Het was een heel moeilijke en zware periode, maar ik had het geluk dat ik het inclusief en hier beweerd, maar dat ik veel heb geleerd, veel vrienden en vriendinnen heb leren kennen zonder handicap, die meenamen naar buiten en waar dat ik bleef slapen en ook heb leren drinken en ook leren roken. Ik weet dat het niet zo gezond is, maar ik wil alles proberen. Dat is wat ik afgestudeerd en ik was 21 jaar en mijn ouders wouden voor mij blijven zorgen aan een bouwen, bijbouwen aan een huis. Maar ik had al in mijn hoofd, ik wil afhankelijk zijn van mijn familie. Ik wou mijn eigen leven bepalen. Ik wou niet naar een instelling gaan. En ik wou zelf bepalen wanneer ik opstop, hoe ik wou verzorgd worden en wat dat ik wat en welke kleren ik wou dragen en ook wat dat ik wou eten en hoe ik met een vrije tijd wou delen en wat ik wou gaan slapen.
Okay, I forgot to say that we will have Sebastian with us, and he will translate everything that Sofie said now in Dutch. And I think it's the right moment. So, Sofie, sorry to interrupt you, and sorry for the audience. So, Sebastian, go ahead, translate. Thank you.
Everybody was trying to figure around with their captions and see if they get translation there. So I'm briefly going to translate for Sofie. Sofie is 48 years old. today. And when she was 21, she finished her school and in essentially office management. She had to follow special education during her youth, and that included that she was during the week in a boarding school away from her family. She was very fortunate that she had an inclusive youth. She joined an inclusive youth movement, where amongst the most important things that she learned, I'm trying to get across some of the humor that she uses, where she learned a lot of things, including smoking and drinking, and that gave her sort of the courage and the strength to see the world from an inclusive point of view. When she finished school, her parents actually wanted her to stay with them, but she refused to, because on the one hand she didn't want to be dependent on her parents, and on the other hand she also didn't want to go live in an institution. She wanted to live in a setting where she would be able to take decisions on her daily life herself, to decide whenever she gets up, what she eats, which clothes she would be wearing during the day, and when she goes to bed. So back to you, Sofie.
Mijn moeder zei dan oké, Sofie, maar ik had nog geen PhD-budget, dus ik kon alleen maar naar een zelfstandig voor studie. En er was geen plaats bij mijn ouders in de buurt. Dus ik ben dan naar naar Vlaanderen in 2000 ben ik verhuisd en de woonvoorziening kreeg dus een jaarlijkse bijdrage van de overheid voor de zorg die ik nodig had voor mijn dagelijkse leven. En dat zelfstandig is gekoppeld aan een sociale appartement dat is toegankelijk, maar dat is niet aangepast. Ik ben dan gaan samenwonen na 8 jaar met mijn vriend, maar die is ook een lichte handicap. Dus die krijgt ook de nodige assistentie 7 dagen op 7, 24 op 24.
Oh, sorry. Mag ik? So the challenge was for Sofie to find a setting where she would get 7-on-7 and 24/7, 24, I think the English translation is 24/7 support. And the only option was in a, I think it's called supported living setting in English, where she has access to assistance 24/7. But the only place where she found such a setting was 150 kilometers away from her family in Ghent, and she is living there since 2000, and since 8 years, if I'm correct, Sophie, you live with your boyfriend, who is also
na 8 jaar. Dat ik
after 8 years, so in 2008, since 2008, you live with your boyfriend, who also has a light handicap, and they are both supported in this setting. Next slide.
andere slide, alsjeblieft. Other slide, please.
Sister,
Ja.
Ja.
Oké.
Probeer samen te vatten, Sofie, alstublieft.
Ja.
Dank je.
Ik het aparte, waar dat we nu worden niet aangepast. Ik heb geen laag keuken en mijn badkamer is totaal niet aangepast. Hij wil ook wel 13 andere rolstoelgebruikers en oudere mensen. En dat is maar in rust. Dus als die kapot is, dan hebben we een probleem.
So in the whole building, there are, aside from Sophie, there are 13 other wheelchair users, but there's only one lift in the whole building, and her apartment in itself is really not adopted to a wheelchair user, so she can't change the height of the kitchen, and the shower and the facilities are really not actually how do you say, built for wheelchair users. And in addition, she cannot access her own little balcony that she has. One story that Sophie always tells, I'll quickly summarize it. If they do a maintenance on the lift and none of the wheelchair users is able to access their or exit their own apartment. So in last summer, Sophie was stuck in her own apartment for 2 or 3 weeks. And whenever she wanted to leave, or the one or twice, 2 times that she wanted to leave, she had the fire brigade had to come and help her out of the apartment. Next slide.
Ik kan wel 7 dagen om 24 hulp krijgen. Maar ik kan niet zelf bepalen welke assistent er meekomt. Ik zie op de dag 10 verschillende assistenten. Ik kan er niet werken als ik er niet wil. En ik moet ook een stagiair toelaten. En de assistentie is alleen binnen huis. Dus voor buitenhuis moet ik vragen aan mijn vrienden voor me te helpen. En ik heb ook niet zomaar de vrijheid om te zeggen, ik wil vandaag naar de zee gaan. Nee, ik moet dat op voorhand met mijn vrienden bespreken.
So aside from the technicalities of her apartment, that's really not suitable. In theory, or on paper, Sofie has access to 24/7 assistance, but the reality is she cannot choose who helps her. So there are days when she sees 10 different assistants, and people who are who are trainees, who are not actually up to the jobs. In addition, the assistance that she has access to only applies within her own four walls. So whenever she wants to go outside, do some shopping or make a trip to the sea, she has no assistance from that organization. In addition, because of a lack of assistance, she cannot get her hair washed in the weekends, and has no option to protest. So whenever she does something outside, she is dependent on organizing it with her friends. Next slide.
Ik sta nu 20 jaar op de wachtlijst voor een verhoogd attestatiebudget. Ik heb me meerdere malen laten haren schouwen voor een andere groep te raken. Sinds mei dit jaar heb ik eindelijk doorgekregen dat ik deelde 18 maanden mijn budget, mijn heel budget zou krijgen. Want nu heb ik een deeltje van mijn budget en dat gaat naar het zelfstandig project, zodat ik mijn vaderzorg toch sowieso heb. Ik zou heel graag een beetje budget zou hebben, zou ik heel graag terugreizen naar mijn familie en een huisje met een tuintje gaan wonen. En een paar assistenten die ik zelf wel een dienst nemen en dan kunnen mijn vrienden zijn en mijn familie zijn. Dank u wel voor te luisteren. Dank u wel, Sofie, from the town.
No worries. So since 20 years, Sofie is actually waiting, is in a waiting list to get an increase on her budget. So she has access, has more funds to be able to pay assistance to accompany her outside of her apartment. And since May this year, she got the news that within the next year and a half, she will actually get a bigger asset budget to be able to organize these things indeed. But what she actually wants to do with this budget, or what her dream is, if you want, is to live in a small accessible house with her boyfriend. With a little garden in the vicinity of her family, where she chooses and organizes her personal assistants herself and the things she wants to do herself, and in order for her friends to be her friends and her family to be her family, and she organizing her life with assistants that she employs as an employer, and that take care of her 24/7 the way she wants to do it. Thanks a lot. Dank u wel. Thanks a lot, Sofie. And over to you, Nadia.
Thank you very much, both of you. And again, Sofie, so statistically, Sofie has been kept out of institutions because they provide her social housing with 24 hours a day support. But you see that it is exactly an institutional culture that is oppressing and limiting her independent life. I really hope that within that they keep their promise, and that you will have your complete budget, so you can go back to your neighborhood and back to your parents and your family, where you have been separated for 20 years now on. Okay, so without further ado, we'll go now to, I hope, a more inspiring case study of the Greece deinstitutionalization strategy, like highlighted in the guidelines. And so without further ado, I give the floor to Antonia Trikalioti. She's from I Live in Greece. So Antonia, the floor is yours, and you can introduce yourself much better than myself. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Nadia, for inviting me to this webinar, although I have not a single good practice to share with the participants. The Greek DI strategy and its ongoing implementation is the ultimate case of how to violate every single paragraph of the UN guidelines all over Greece with the use of EU funds. But let's take it from the top. From time to time in Greek recent history, whenever a case of abuse in an institution was coming to light, the public or private authority that ran that institution was getting renamed, and in some cases, they were having the walls and the cages of the institution painted and with happy bright colors, and the problem was considered to be fixed. Until 2016, that an extremely severe case of a public institution located in Lechena for disabled children who remained there as adults, most of them dying in their 20s, became publicly known, with the devastating pictures of children and young adults in cages being chemically and physically restrained, being injured, naked and dirty, being fed only with soft food, of course, being excluded from any kind of education. So the global outcry was huge, and the government realized that Greece needs a DI strategy, not only for that institution, but the national one. The situation in Lechena was and remains urgent. Therefore, a DI procedure for that institution has started in 2017. Before the drafting of our national DI strategy. Many DPOs and the National Confederation of Disabled People were actively involved in planning the DI of Lechena. The final plan is to move all the residents of that institution to group homes of 4 persons, which are named supported living accommodations, located in flats in the same town, while the institution is in the outskirts of the town. So far, 7 years later, 20 residents have been moved in these group homes, while there are more left waiting for their relocation. I must admit that their living conditions have been improved, but they are not deinstitutionalized from any point of view. Next slide, please. The DI procedure of Lehena was characterized as an excellent practice, and it has been copied to the national DI strategy. Our organization, iLiving, was invited to the consultations of that strategy that have lasted for several months in 2020, and it was assigned to the EASPD. I remember the first consultation where more than 60 stakeholders were there, representatives from ministries, managers of private and public institutions, the Greek Church, the European Union, the EASPD, UNICEF, the National Confederation of Disabled People, of course, and representatives of associations of parents of disabled people. When the main plan of building supported living accommodations where institutionalized persons were going to be moved in and new admissions to be made was introduced, I and my colleague from iLiving, Camille Kumkor, were striving to prove that these group homes are institutions according to the General Comment number 5 of the UNCRPD, even by reading paragraphs from it. But since both the EASPD and the National Confederation of Disabled People were reassuring every stakeholder that these group homes are not institutions, which minister and which parent could have trusted two severely disabled persons from an unknown small organization, and which representatives of institutions would agree with us, since their interests were opposed. We were even being told that me and Camille are afraid of ending up in a group home, and that is why we are trying to stop their foundation, and that we don't care about persons with different impairments, that according to everyone else, they could not possibly live outside group homes. Of course, the EASPD and the National Confederation knew that we were right. You see, in Greece, parents of persons with intellectual impairments are afraid of independent living. So I contacted the vice chair of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and he accepted to join a consultation and make clear to everyone that these supported living accommodations are institutions. Then I proposed his participation to the ministry, and they refused, probably because they already knew that they were going to build new small institutions that are not aligned to the convention. At the same period, I was contributing to the drafting of the UN guidelines. I kept on mentioning in the Greek DI consultations that the upcoming DI strategy is going to violate every guideline of the UN. But the Greek authorities have not taken my advice, even if it was for free, while the UN was paying me to contribute to the guidelines. I think that this was hilarious, and it indicates how things work in Greece. Next slide, please. The outcome of these fiasco consultations, in view of chapters 1 to 3 of the guidelines, is the foundation of 133 supported living accommodations so far, with 713 disabled persons living there. Every Greek administrative region is now founding more supported living accommodations, financed by the EU structural and investment funds. In this accommodation, there is an obligatory sharing of assistance with others and no influence as to who provides the assistance. In many cases, it is the same staff of the big-scale institution. There is also lack of control over day-to-day decisions, lack of choice for the individuals concerned over with whom they live, identical activities for everyone under a certain authority, supervision of living arrangements, and even supervision of their communications with the outside world. and only disabled persons, of course, live in these accommodations. These settings have been falsely characterized as community-based just because they are located in cities and towns, and they have furniture that you can find as well in real homes, and not only medical equipment and furniture. Housing and support, of course, is packaged together. The residents of these settings have no right to apply for personal assistance, while the residents of the big-scale institutions are not connected with personal assistance schemes before leaving institutions. They can apply for personal assistance, but only if they provide proof that they will move out of the institution, which is practically impossible. The DI strategy and its implementation is led by managers of institutions and not by those affected of institutionalization. Disabled persons have no housing alternative. There is no plan for housing support or peer support. There is only funding of and plans for every type of segregation settings, such as daycare centers and sheltered workshops. Next slide, please. A month ago, iLiving has questioned the Ministry of Social Cohesion about the number of new admissions and about how they prevent institutionalization. Let me read their answer for you. In the past, families of disabled persons who could not make it anymore with the needs of their disabled members, they had to contact large-scale institutions, while now, with the new legal framework, these families have the choice of contacting the authorities that run the community-based supported living accommodations. As you can see, according to the ministry, this is a decision and an obligation of the families. The disabled individual has no word, and the Greek authorities have no obligation to support the disabled persons and their families with individualized home-based services. This is the general concept and mentality in Greece, even now that the new minister is quite nice. She is willing to talk about it and learn from us. She faces limitations because of the strategy, of the parental movement, of every stakeholder. She lacks proper technical support, and in politics, time is always limited for such big changes. I see Nadia on my screen now, so my time is limited too. I hope I haven't made you too sad. Thank you for your tolerance.
Thank you very much, Antonia, for sharing with us. In fact, you're sharing with us how they keep institutions, just transforming the form of them and they keep everything in their own hands. As long as it's not used as a lead, the institutionalization will never be a big success. So let's go to the next speaker with, I hope, more inspiring practices. So without further ado, I will give the floor now to our friends from Japan, who will highlight how the involvement of persons with disability and deinstitutionalization can be a success. So without further ado, I give the floor to Noboru Imamura. He is a member of the Japanese Council on Independent Living Centers, and he will speak in Japanese, but there will be translation at the same time. So the floor is yours.
はい。皆さん、こんにちは。日本の今村昇と申します。
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Noboru Imamura.
私は、普段は、東京の自立生活センターステップ江戸川で代表をしております。
I work for Independent Living Center called Step Edogawa in Tokyo.
また、全国団体としては、全国自立生活センター協議会の副代表と DPI ジャパンの事務局次長をしています。
I also serve as a Vice President of Japan Council of Independent Living Centers and also a Deputy Secretary General for the DPI Japan, Disabled People International Japan.
最初に簡単に次、日本の現状を少しお話しします。 次のページをお願いします。
Next slide, please. First, I will talk about where we stand in Japan about deinstitutionalization.
日本には、日本では約40年ほど前にアメリカから自立生活センターが伝わりました。
To Japan, about 40 years ago, the concept of independent living passed on from United States.
そして約30年ほど前に全国自立生活センター協議会が発足し、現在は全国各地に約120の CIL があります。
Then, about 30 years ago, JIL, Japan Council of Independent Living Centers, has been formed. And currently, we have 120 independent living centers across Japan.
自立生活センターとは、障害当事者が主体となって、自立生活運動と介助サービスなどの事業を行っています。
Japan Independent Living Centers works to assist people with disability to become independent in the community. And also, we dispatch PA services so that people can access PAs in community setting.
JIL と DPI の関係について少しお話しします。
Let me just briefly talk about the relationship between JIL and DPI.
JIL の加盟団体が全国各地で起きている問題を DPI に提供し、DPI が政策提言をしていくという補完関係にあります。
We work in such a way that JIL, we are across Japan, so we collect data and also hearings from local grassroots voices from people with disabilities, and then we raise this issue to DPI Japan.
日本は国連から、国連の権利委員会から、勧告を受けており、その中で、主に2つのことが指摘されています。
And JIL and DPI works in a way that from JIL, the voice of grassroots advocacy, and DPI works on policies based on those voices delivered by JIL. And then Japan recently have received a UN committee given the Japanese government concluding observations on mainly 2 points, inclusive education and deinstitutionalization.
で、今回は、私たちが関わった、事例で、好事例についてお話をします。
Today, I'd like to introduce one of the cases, the good practice for the institutionalization.
次のページをお願いします。
Next slide, please.
施設に入っていた障害者がたまたま自立生活センターのスタッフと出会うことがありました。
It happened. It was coincident, but a person who are living in an institution happened to meet with the person with disabilities from independent living centers.
そのたまたま施設に入ったたまたま出会った施設に入っていた障害者は、自立に関心を示しましたが、コロナ禍に入ってしまって直接会うことが困難になりました。
And because of this coincidental meeting, but the person who are living in the institution, he got very interested in independence, his independence in the community. However, it was a time that pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic hit at the same time. So it was difficult for him to meet often with independent living centers.
しかし、オンラインミーティングを通じて、彼は、IL のトレーニング、を受けることができました。
Due to the pandemic, they couldn't meet in person, but they did continue their communication through online, and he received different training on IL independent living training toward his independence.
そして、1日24時間のパーソナルアシスタントサービスの支給などの必要なサポートが整ったことで、彼はようやく施設を出て自立した生活を送ることができるようになりました。
In addition to this training, also the community, in the community, we could prepare the support, necessary support, such as 24 hours PA services, to be ready for him to be in the community. So he could leave the institutions.
次のページをお願いします。
Next, please.
この事例でのポイントは、7つあります。
So with this example, we find 7 items or 7 important points that we have learned with this process.
まず一つ目は、自立生活センターの当事者や、当事者スタッフとの出会いがあったこと。
First, the person who is in the institution had the opportunity to meet outside person with disabilities, in this case specifically, person from independent living centers.
で、二つ目は、そのスタッフが中心となって、いろんな支援体制を作ったこと。
The second point is this particular person from CIL, he took a lead to coordinate to ensure a support system for his transition.
三つ目は、初期の財政的支援が得られたこと。
And also, there was a sufficient funding was secured for the initial part of the transition.
四つ目は、オンラインでのやり取りについて、病院、施設側の協力が得られたこと。
And also, the communication between institutions and CIL, they could maintain this ongoing communication with the support from the institution as well.
そして五つ目は、十分なパーソナルアシスタンスの支給決定時間が認められたこと。
で、for him to live in the community, he could secure necessary hours of PA services guaranteed by the local government.
そして六つ目は、自立生活センターで介助者が確保できたこと。
で、also, together with ours, actual human resources as a PA, CIL could provide necessary numbers of PAs.
7つ目は、地域移行ができた後も自立生活センターが、引き続き彼のサポートをして彼の居場所となったこと。
And finally, after the transition, this individual who came out of the institution continued to be connected with CIL, and he became very active in the community, and CIL became his activity, his places of that where he can be active.
次のページお願いします。
Next, please.
今後の取り組みについてお話しします。3つあります。
So from here, how we proceed, go way forward toward the institutionalization, I raise 3 points.
まず1つ目は、自立生活センターなどとの出会いが偶然ではなく、公的な仕組みとして機能するような制度化を働きかけています。
Now we are advocating to systematically we can meet with the individuals in the institutions, not just a coincidence, but actually we can, so that we should have the certain system that we should be able to meet the people in the institutions.
2つ目は、その働きかけの成果の一つとして、今年から、地域移行コーディネーターという、役割の配置が予算化されました。
Through this advocacy, we have new budget allocated for transition coordinator placed in the local community.
3つ目は、来年度、国に設定される予定の入所施設のあり方検討会というのが、予定されています。
And next year, Japanese government, national government will set up a study group or more on a task force to examine the residential facilities and community transition.
この検討会で、脱施設の目標期限などの設定が打ち出せるかということと、新規入所を止められるかということが、今後の大きな注目するポイントになります。
For this committee or task force, it will be a milestone that if we could set up tangible goals for the institutionalization and with the specific dates, due dates, and then also how we can prevent new admission to the institutions.
以上になります。ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much.
Thank you, both of you, Masami and Noboru, for sharing this with us. And so without further ado, I'm looking at the time. I will hand over to our next speaker, who is Nic. Nic will really highlight a little bit more about the implementation. So up to you, Nic Crosby. He's the National Development Team. He's a member of the National Development Team for Inclusion and the European Coalition for the Community Living from the UK. The floor is yours.
Hi, Nadia. Thank you. Hello, everybody. I hope you can see me. So I've got 10 minutes just to tackle all the problems that there are when it comes to closing institutions. As Ines knows, I'm Nadia. I tend to get really practical about things. So I'm talking about actually what it takes to close institutions. and the practical challenges and some of the solutions that have come up. I'm referring, and there's a link at the end, or there's a report at the end that I've highlighted that might be useful, because some of the examples I'm going to talk to come from there. Anyway, so without further ado, next slide, please. The biggest challenge, I think, is leadership. We've heard about leadership that has not delivered the change in Antonia's presentation. So I think leadership is a challenge I've encountered in the UK. It's also in some of the work that I've done with colleagues in Slovenia, where there hasn't been a commitment. The ambition has been very muddy. The vision hasn't been clear about what people wanted to achieve. Often you've got some people who will have a very clear vision of closing institutions, and other people seem to have very different ideas about what the program is around. People don't tend to stay the distance, people move on, and often it's difficult to find out about accountability. Those tend to be the problems. I think what I've found, and in some of the case studies that are in the report shared later, is that it's often down to a very strong group of people to lead that change. Certainly, there's a group within Slovenia who are very strong, very clear voices, and keep making the case for that leadership, the need to close institutions. If I think about the work that happened in Trieste, again, it was a group of people with a very clear vision, and they made it happen. And all of them showed that commitment, the ambition, the vision, the staying the distance, and the accountability. And all of them notably include people with disabilities. So I think it's that inclusive voice of people who know that this has to happen, and this change has to happen, that will make it happen. There's no prescription for how you find the right leaders. This is the one thing that's a bit variable, I guess. The other problems I'm going to talk about in a minute are it's a little easier to see the solutions, but success does come with visionary leadership. And that's not just one person, it's a group of people. It takes much more than one person. And that group of people always includes people with lived experience. Next slide, please. Often people will talk about money. They'll say we don't have enough, but it'll be too expensive. We can't afford all the change, and it'll cost more than it does when it comes to putting people in institutions. And I think, that it's a myth. We did a recent piece of work with friends in Slovenia. We costed up an institution. The total cost, the buildings, the staff, the maintenance, the buses, the gardening and everything, all of that came to over 6.5 million euros. And when we divided by that by the number of people supported by the institution, we saw that there was about 130,000 euros per person. So if you think about that, that's a lot of support that could be bought with that 130,000 euros. We've done the same in England. In England, the costs are a lot higher. So we're talking about people who are supported for 15,000, 20,000 pounds a week. And that money can be much better used in the community, and it costs a lot less. And we've got evidence in both countries of the same thing, that it's much more efficient to support people to live in the community, mainly because once people are living in the community, they're not as reliant on the institution to deliver all their support. They have a local doctor, they have a local community to be part of. They don't need all the provision that comes with an institution. So I think the thing about money is the solution is some seriously clear and good financial information, and actually establishing that this is about changing the way that the same amount of money is used. It's not necessarily finding lots of new money. Next slide, please. Often people talk about the local community being a barrier. That the local community is very reliant on the institution for jobs, which is true in a sense, because people have their job and they work in the institution, and that the attitudes within the local community are very negative. I think that the thing is that if an institution closes, that it's not like the need for people to get support is going to disappear. It's not as if suddenly all those people in the institution are going to move out and they're not going to need any more support or personal assistance. So the fact is that it's not that jobs will go, it's that jobs will change. I think what the problem is that when I've spoken with lots of different people across Europe, is that these positive messages aren't often given out early enough in the closure process. So I'm thinking of a case in Moldova where we did a case study. It's in the report later. There's a case study in Moldova, and one of the very first things they did was identify all the new jobs that they would need if they're going to close this institution. It was an institution for children and young people. And they went out and they said very, very clearly to the community that this is what's happening. And they said the same to the workforce. And they invited the workforce and the community to think about whether they would like one of those jobs. So they took it out as a positive message rather than something where the workforce aren't included in the process and can become a real barrier. And I've seen that very clearly in some of the work I've been involved in. So I think there's something about people being very positive. When it comes to attitude, I put this blue horse up here. This blue horse comes as a real serious, had a very serious purpose. In 1973, they set out to close the institution, San Giovanni Institution in Trieste. And it's an institution for people with psychosocial support needs. And one of the very first things that the team leading that process, I've just seen your note, Nadia. I will talk even faster. One of the things that they learned with it, the team did was actually they opened the doors of the institution in 1973 and they never closed them again. And they celebrated opening the doors by building a great big blue horse and parading it around the streets of Trieste. And it was the beginning of actually inviting the community into the institution. They had to do a lot of changing of attitudes, but they did that in a very positive way by inviting the community in. And there's work still modeled on that that's going on in Slovenia and elsewhere, where there's a big impetus to involve the community in the life of people within the institutions. So next slide, please. There's often a thing that's said that some people just can't live in the community. It's simply not true. This is a photograph of a young woman called Louise. Louise's support needs are very complicated, and often people like in Louise's situation would always have been in an institution. She'd been in a number of institutions, but she was supported to live in the community because people actually listened to her. And they worked out how best to support by listening to what worked and what mattered to Louise. They didn't necessarily look at all the diagnosis and all the labels that had been attached to her in her history. And she's successfully living and has done for the number of years in the community and has a much better life. I can't go into it in detail, I haven't got time, but there's a really clear thing that there is no reason why anybody can't live in the community. It's simply providing the support that works for them. Next slide, please. I often encounter this where you're talking about DI and everybody gets wrapped up in building new buildings, building new group homes, new places to live. And actually, it's often a case of what they're forgetting is that this isn't about buildings, it's about people. It's about people's lives, and people will choose who they want to live with. People will choose if they want to live independently. And it's about listening to people and then thinking about what the solutions are to help that person live. It's often not building new homes. It's often finding homes that are available within the local community that could be rented, can have a tenancy, but they fit and work for that individual person. So it's not about being building centered. It's definitely about people centered. Next slide, please. So that's the report. It says link here. I've just remembered that I've forgotten to put the link in there, so we can put that on. I'll either get that in the chat after this, or I'll make sure I'll send it on to Nadia and in an email to share around. So I think that just to recap, there's no problems. There's no new problems. Anybody who says they've got a new problem is, well, not realizing that everybody's always had the same problems and there's always solutions to those problems. The real challenge is actually remembering why you're doing the work. Strategies are really important, but if you forget why you're having to work so hard, then no strategy is going to help, because what you're doing is you're thinking about how you and all those who are working with you are thinking about doing the right thing. It's simpler. It's as simple as that. It's about giving people a chance to have a better life living independently in the community, and you never need to lose sight of that. Closing institutions is better for everybody. And that's not just the people in the institutions, but it's better for the wider society, and it's better for community. And it doesn't matter what sort of evidence you want to find, whether it's economic, whether it's contribution, whether it's quality of life. Closing institutions is always better for everyone. It's a bit of a dash. I hope it's useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nic, for highlighting how it should be done differently. And so without further ado, now we're going to somebody who will really illustrate how funding and resources could stimulate independent living and a right way to close institution. So without further ado, I give the floor to Michelle O'Leil. She's from the Stahili Foundation. So Michelle, the floor is yours, please.
Great. Thank you very much, colleagues. I'm really grateful to be here today and speak about the important topic of the allocation of funding. I guess I'm the elephant in the room, as funding is always that elephant in the room when we discuss care reforms, as Nic alluded to. But today I'm going to try to give a bit of a positive message through two case examples through our work in Kenya and our experience building that evidence and making the case for the allocation of funding to deinstitutionalization, but also care reform efforts more generally. I'm also, as I do this, going to try to unpack a little bit the guidelines, because they provide us with some really important recommendations and ways forward, which have been integrated in some of the work that we have done, and how these efforts, and try to unpack our perspective and our experience in how we support the government to transition the model of care and protection from one in Kenya, for example, that still currently heavily relies on residential care, to one which is inclusive, to one which sees children grow up in families and communities where their best interests are served, and of course, where their individual needs are actually met. So I will highlight a couple of good practices to give you a little bit of background. So Stahili Foundation is a small organization that works in Kenya. We started our work in Murang'a County along the Kenyan government about a decade ago. Murang'a is one of 47 countries, home to approximately under 500,000 children. And the lessons we've learned in Murang'a over the years are now being scaled up in other neighboring counties, and thanks to the generous support of donors who have invested in care reform or redirected, and I'm emphasizing those two words, from residential care to family and community-based solutions. Of course, like colleagues I see here on the call, we started our work alongside the government, but this was a time when care reform and DI funding was really non-existent to organizations and efforts like ours, especially small locally registered NGOs like Stahili. Convincing donors was super hard. It was difficult. The common question, Nic, you raised it, what happens to the building? Often asked. We had the challenges also in funding the various components we needed to support children, both at the child level, the institution level, and we'll talk about it very briefly at the system level. Today, we remain a small organization, so not to present a picture that we have sort of immense resources. However, there are efforts that can draw and continue to grow those efforts on the ground. We're grateful to the donors who have provided specific funding, and those are the two examples I'm going to provide, to care reform or DI more directly. Of course, it remains a challenge, as I'm sure many of us on this call also face challenges in funding. But I do want to highlight the good practices. So how do we convince funders? Let me get to it. The first I'll say is that we need to build the evidence and make the case. In addition to the funding elephant, we had another funding elephant in the room at the time in which we started our efforts in the process in Moronga to deinstitutionalize and ensure that systems were strong for children. That was data. The elephant was data. We knew about the situation in some institutions. We had an idea. We were working with some alongside the government, but there was no real comprehensive understanding of the situation, or how many children were in care. Where did they come from? What were the reasons for their placement, which of course is necessary to address and support their reunification. How many children, how many have disabilities? Among so many questions, neither Stahili nor the government at this stage could comprehensively answer those key questions. Without data, we basically knew that these efforts would not be informed. We would leave children behind, and especially those children with disabilities. And without this information, admittedly, I have to say that it was incredibly difficult to fundraise. So for colleagues on the call, data is, and I will talk how it's been a bit of a game changer. It allows us to plan, budget, convince donors also to support our efforts. The guidelines, just bringing us back to the main theme of this webinar, is clear in paragraph 63 that existing institutions should be mapped and that funding currently going to those institutions should be identified and, of course, redirected to services that respond to individual needs of children and express requirements of persons with disability. While we had already undertaken our process, like many of us, at this point, we had actually closed a number of institutions together with the government. But in 2019, we supported the government with an assessment of the situation of children in residential care. Thanks, of course, to the generous support of a donor, UBS Optimus Foundation, and with the technical support also of Changing the Way We Care. This was a bit of a game changer for us. From the perspective of funding, it was pivotal to our efforts and to make DI a reality. With data actually in hand, we planned. And that's been from our experience. At the same time, the evidence showed us that we had incredible challenges and significant work to do in addressing those gaps to prevent family separation, building family-based alternatives, which were pretty much non-existent when we started to work. And of course, multiple other actions at the systems level. With the small resources we had, and I liked what Nic had to say about that, we were able to come together with the government. We were able to pilot small programs because, of course, alternatives we found, as Nic mentioned, to be cheaper. We documented those lessons, and I stress this for NGO colleagues on the ground, how important it was. We developed SOPs, standard operating procedures, and those SOPs today are part of the national framework. We worked with donors to redirect their funding, resulting, for example, in one donor redirecting all of its funding from a residential care institution to support family and community-based care, including supported independent living, which in Kenya is among the formal care options in the legal framework. Today, we support, of course, small efforts, but small efforts, of course, together across many partners made big change. Today, we support more than 50 young persons in supported independent living. And thanks to the flexible donors, and I'm sure I don't have very much time, but we'll speed up a bit, have been able to develop standards around this as well, around this form of care, including mentorship guidelines developed with persons who have lived experience. These are among the actions. In a 10-minute talk, of course, happy to speak with colleagues after this webinar if you're interested. These were among the efforts that we took to really understand our context, which is what I want to emphasize to colleagues. When we want to make change, we need to know why, how, who, with them, because anything without them is not for them, and make the case about what needs to be done. We were better prepared to fundraise, and also donors were also better to receive our information and understand why we really needed to allocate certain funding. Colleagues may be wondering on a discussion about funding that I'm impressing upon building the evidence and making the case. With this information we had, reform was no longer Michelle's idea, the Western concept, Staheli's idea, an academic idea, et cetera, Many of us have heard these arguments before. It was possible. We were able to better openly identify gaps and advocate for support to fill them. These efforts, in the first grant being received by Staheli specifically for deinstitutionalization and for care reform more broadly in 2020. The first funder, a Dutch-based organization, Stichting Weeshuis de Doopsgezinnen, a great partner of ours and funder, and I use them as a really good example. While their name in Dutch translates to the Mennonite Orphanage Foundation, this funder is a great example of one which redirected its support to global efforts, not only ours, and also quite a number of years ago. What do these investments look like? We're talking about funding allocation. Well, the guidelines are clear. Paragraph 78, they remind us a really important point. Funding models for support services should be flexible, and they should not be limited to supply. They call for investment. The guidelines call for them, investment in the creation and development of a wide range of services and flexible support services. They should respond to the diverse needs of individuals, and they should be taken in line with individualized case management. Donors like Stichting Weeshuis understood that care reform was complex. It takes time. Like deinstitutionalization itself, it is a process and not an event. It entails multifaceted challenges at the systems level. And the funder recognized this and worked together with us that reform should be government-led and supported by CSOs, and to also recognize the challenges that come with that particular collaboration as well, and in collaboration with other civil society organizations. Funds were able to be used by us both at the child intervention level and at the system-based level. I'm sure that colleagues can appreciate that the latter is a bit harder sometimes to find. Stichting Weeshuis understood our need for government officers, social workers, counselors to be adequately trained to support reunification processes and ultimate reintegration into families or communities. They continue to fund it. By building this case, continuing to document, we continue to better explain to donors that there's no one-size-fits-all package and that case management is an individual process, flexible and not limited to supply, as the guidelines say, had become a reality for our operations because of this donor for the first time, in line with the guidelines. And we were able to develop a range of services. The donors also understood the need for flexible solutions to properly realize the rights of the child, including for children with disabilities. How else did we help demonstrate this? And
Michelle, sorry. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, am I out of time?
Yes, please. If you don't mind, just to
I'll give a little bit of a wrap up here. But another thing that has been really helpful for advocating for the allocation of funds is the identification of champions. As Nic noted, success requires visionary leadership. And that also includes donors like Legatum Foundation and others who are coming in to support jointly for care reform. One last point I would really want to emphasize is seeing the positive change that can come out of it has been a game changer. Advocacy for funds, the national transition guidelines in Kenya, and the subsequent training which is being provided on the ground to partners is helping us dream big. It's helping us see what institutions can actually deliver at the community level. And sometimes if we start from this positive approach, as Nic said, I think we may do a better job at advocating for ourselves for some funds. Thanks so much for the time, and apologies for going over.
Okay, thank you very much, Michelle. And I'm really sorry, I'm really out of time. So I will not resume because we had so wise speakers. They give so great different inputs that I will just thank the captionings and interpreter that we keep them again much longer. So without further ado, I will give the floor now to Sander to announce the next webinar session that will be organized. So don't hesitate, please, to send us your questions, your remark, any feedback, and that we could use, and we will definitely come back to you. And also open new discussion, open new topics. That's why we are organizing these webinars. So thank you very much. And so I give the floor now over to Sander, if he's with us.
Yes, thank you so much, Nadia. Yeah. So the presentations were really excellent, thoughtful, inspiring, like great. The next session, we already have the date for the next session, so you can put it in your calendar. That will be on the 13th of November. That will be a Wednesday. So in that time, not a Thursday, but a Wednesday, the 13th of November. We will focus on two specific issues, the legal and policy frameworks under the guidelines, and also remedies, reparations, and redress. We will have speakers from the Latin American Coalition on Deinstitutionalization, from the Asian Coalition on DI, from the Global Coalition, and we will have other experts with us from different continents. So hopefully that will be similarly good as this one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Ines has put in the chat the email, contact email from the Global Coalition. Please don't hesitate. Thanks again to all the speakers for your time, for Kali, those who are in the middle of the night, those who are early in the morning, those who are with us with extra support. So many thanks for all of you, and please keep chasing us so that together we could realize deinstitutionalization for every single person. Thanks a lot, and see you at the next webinar. Bye, everybody.